Hi, I'm Mark from Property Ventures. Welcome to this week's New Zealand Property Podcast, where we interview the property expert around New Zealand. Welcome back to the New Zealand Property Podcast and the video series, and today I have a very special guest, a customer speaker in front of a bigger group. It's only you and me today, mate. Ashley Church from the New Zealand Property Institute, so welcome along.
Thank you very much, mate. Looking forward to the chat.
All good. Thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing a lot from you, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners and watchers of today will be also. But before we start, one question I want to learn more about myself is if you can just tell the listeners a bit about who you are, and in particular what the New Zealand Property Institute actually is, because a lot of people out there won't know at all.
Sure. So firstly, in the interest of being pedantic, it's actually the Property Institute of New Zealand, and the reason that's important is because that creates the acronym PINS.
Right.
Which the other way around doesn't work. So Property Institute of New Zealand is a professional institute which represents property professionals. So at the moment we represent every valuer in the country. Mm-hmm. So industrial, commercial, residential valuers are all members of the institute. We also represent commercial property advisors, commercial property managers, plant and machinery valuers, and we have just brought into the fold an organisation called the Independent Property Managers Association, IPMA, which represents residential property managers. So it's a broad church, no pun intended, of property professionals who operate within the property industry.
Okay, so the rules when the rules changed with the property valuers several years ago, where they now go through this group of people that choose who's going to do the valuation. Is that a part of what was set up for them?
No, that was actually a commercial decision made by the banks. So those are called valuation ordering services, VOSs, and there's two of them that operate within New Zealand. And that was a decision by the banks, which was essentially cloned on the practice that operates in Australia. So it applies to a part of the market, but there's still an enormous amount of business that's done by valuers that doesn't go through those services. Okay,
a couple of acronyms already there, so we'll see how many we can do in the next week. Good work. Okay, what about yourself? You've obviously been in property for quite some time. A lot of people won't know too much about you.
So originally from Hawke's Bay, Napier's my hometown. Did when I was very young, still in nappies, did 9 years on the Napier City Council, 3 terms. Left Hawke's Bay in the late 90s. And had a variety of roles, essentially change management roles in organisations, which was about fixing broken organisations. And along the way, one of those roles was with the Auckland Property Investors Association, so I was CEO there for a few years. Have been a property investor in my own right since the early 80s. Mm-hmm. So I've been in and around property for a very, very long time. Owned a company called Property Plus during the late 2000s. And obviously came into this role after a 3 or 4 year stint with the Newmarket Business Association as CEO a few years back. Okay. So, as I say, mainly change management roles, mainly about organisations that needed to be moved from one place to another.
Right, great stuff. And I heard you speak a couple of months ago at the GRA event that Sunday, and it was actually very impressive just sort of hearing you talk about the last 40, 50 years of cycles over New Zealand. But it's been interesting to see how it's progressed and how some things are very similar. Other issues have obviously moved on and changed. So.
So the last 40, 50 years in particular is actually a pretty strong guide as to, if you want to know where we're going in the future, then the past is the history of the property market's a reasonably clear guide. It's not absolutely guaranteed, but we can extrapolate some things. And one of the things that tells us pretty clearly is that the property market, particularly in Auckland, but also further south in New Zealand, tends to double in value every 10 to 12 years.
Yeah. Okay, jolly good. Well, let's get into it. The Labour, or the coalition parties led by Labour, or Winston at the moment, has been in for 7 or 8 months. What's your take on how things are going, where things are at, how things are different?
Not well.
The floor is yours. Not well. Not a good start.
So a couple of things. If I was to single out Phil Twyford as Minister of Housing and Minister of Infrastructure, I think he's actually doing an okay job. He's got to focus on building more homes, which is exactly what we need, particularly in Auckland. And he's focused on doing things which are becoming increasingly pragmatic relative to the market. So in respect of his scorecard, it's a qualified pass. That's about as far as I can be complimentary, unfortunately. In the financial policy space, financial management space. This crowd are doing some things that have the potential to be disastrous for the property market. Some of the stuff that Grant Robertson's doing, for example, around ring fencing of tax losses, the prospect of a capital gains tax on property, and some of the other initiatives that are being taken. If I didn't know better, you could easily believe that they were deliberately taking steps to destroy the property market. There's some pretty scary stuff taking place right now.
Mm. Yeah, and so what sort of moving forward, we hear them say they suggest what they're going to do. Do you think those rules are going to come in?
Ring fencing of tax losses, yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a given. Whether or not an incoming government beyond this crowd would continue with that's still an open question. Capital gains taxes, I think they'll propose them. I think they'll come forward as one of the recommendations of the tax working group. I personally believe it will actually be one of the reasons they're not re-elected in 2020. I think New Zealanders are actually just simply not going to put up with that.
Mm. And maybe it'll delay enough that it doesn't get through before then. Who knows?
Well, they've actually said they've made quite clear that the work of the tax working group, which is being chaired by Michael Cullen, will make some recommendations. I think the draft recommendations are in February of next year, and then July or August the full recommendations. They've actually made it quite clear that they won't introduce those prior to the 2020 election, and in fact they've said that they will go to the 2020 election with seeking a mandate from the electorate to introduce them.
Right. Okay, and as you said, that may be the reason one of the reasons they don't get re-elected. Who knows?
One of them, yeah.
Yeah. Won't talk too much about the government today, by the sounds of it. All good. We'll talk about where you see the future in the next couple of years in a few minutes, probably because of what we've talked about. But right now, we're finding, particularly in Auckland and even Christchurch, actually, where a lot of sales go through. Maybe it's a bit of where actually we are as a company rather than where the market is. Where do you see at the moment? What do you know at the moment of the sales around the main centres of New Zealand? For places coming on the market and the sales and prices, and whether they...
Yeah, so sales are pretty flat at the moment, and that's indicative primarily of the fact that we're in the flattening period of the cycle. So the property cycle is pretty predictable.
Yep.
We reached the peak of this market in 2016. We know that from data. And then the market's been flattening off since. If it follows the course of previous cycles, then it will stay flat, relatively flat for the next 2 to 3 years, with an expectation. This isn't an exact science, but with an expectation that it will probably start to pick up 2021, maybe early 2022. So what that means in respect of the market currently is that firstly there'll be. Obviously, it'll take longer to sell a property, but it does also mean for people who are investing in property that the opportunity to be able to negotiate a better price is probably the strongest it's been now in 10 years. So for an investor, it's actually a very good time to be buying property, provided there's not an expectation of quick capital growth.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think most people would sort of say too at the moment. Don't expect unless you are creating equity by subdividing or whatever. Don't look at. Don't expect the capital gains for a wee while. I think the main difference I've seen between this and the last cycle was the last cycle when it went to the peak, it did drop in some areas quite substantially. And I still have I always say had the feeling now that it was still going to in the smaller parts of New Zealand, but maybe it's not.
A couple of things about that.
The flat.
A couple of things. So firstly, worth remembering that the peak of the cycle last time was around the time of the GFC.
Yeah.
And so the GFC was kind of a little bit of it was a very unusual event in the context of the property market, and so there was probably a more pronounced impact on the market after the GFC than there has been prior to following previous booms. Mm-hmm. Having said that, we're still only talking an average of about 7 or 8% drop across the country. So even after something as extreme as the GFC, we still didn't see a dramatic drop. But you're right, and it's worth mentioning, because I often talk about the market as if it's sort of one generic amorphous thing, when in fact it's not. New Zealand's made up of many markets, and if you go back to, for example, 2003, when people were buying properties for 40 or 50 grand in Tokoroa, and they were increasing in value to 50 or 100 grand. Immediately after that particular cycle finished, most of them fell back to 40 or 50 grand. Yeah. So there are exceptions to that doubling rule. And recognising that there are locations where those prices are built on speculation rather than the fundamentals of the property cycle.
Yeah, I was living in a little small town in New Zealand back then myself, and I've been in places, but I was dealing in quite a few of those markets, and I know especially back then I was interested in the Tauranga. I always said Tauranga was the far north, Wanganui, the sort of place, and it was Central Otago, funny enough, back then had incredible losses, but they come back this time. It seems to just flattening out. I know. a year and a half ago, South and West Auckland probably dropped, I'd say, as a guess, 10%,
Yep.
and it's slowly come back and it's still levelled out, stayed again.
I mean, the comparison I would use is when you look at the property market, it's a bit like a serrated saw. So the saw goes up and down, but the trend line's up. So sometimes the tooth on the saw drops a little bit more, but the general trend line's always up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Great stuff. So, overseas buyers. Let's talk about them. Before you talk, I'm going to go first. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, I read an article, and I think it's been blown out of proportion how many overseas buyers there are overall. But it did say Central Auckland had something like 15 or 20%.
19.3.
Oh, there you go, it's close to it. 19.3% of foreign buyers, which makes sense to me because a lot of the brand new apartments in Auckland, New Zealanders can't afford them, and they're only selling them to foreign buyers anyway. What's your take on that?
Oh, so that wasn't unexpected. If you think about what happens after a government introduces an excise tax on tobacco or alcohol, or there's a sudden increase announced in the price of a commodity, people tend to rush out and stock up on it. Before that price comes into effect. Petrol's another one. When there's a big increase in petrol, people will go out and fill their cars. Exactly the same phenomenon, obviously, albeit on a much larger asset. But so clearly people, foreign buyers were made aware that the government was looking at introducing this ban. They essentially got into the market and purchased properties as quickly as they could. That had the effect of increasing those percentages quite dramatically during that quarter. Wouldn't expect that to be an ongoing trend. And if you look at that trend going back over previous quarters, it's been much, much lower. 3 or 4% has been about the average.
Well, even then it still had, even though that was extremely high at 19.3%, the overall average in New Zealand was extremely low.
Yes, it was.
Which says nothing else is happening around New Zealand as far as foreign buyers, or very, very little.
Yeah, so is it by way of...
And that's the peak, apparently. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
So by way of an example, the previous quarter, the number of foreign sales had been 2.9% of the total number of sales sold in the country. In the quarter that we're talking about, it was 3.3. So there's virtually no change nationwide.
Yeah, okay. Okay, what else will people ask? Interest rates. Actually, what's going on with interest rates in the next few years?
So interest rates are going to be really interesting. So if you look, the reason interest rates are as low as they are, and they've been low now for a decade. It would be tempting to actually call that systemic, meaning that they're permanent, which I'm not quite sure I believe. But the reason they're as low as they are is because following the GFC, a number of economies around the world, in order to kickstart their economies, started printing money. This term, quantitative easing, which is about essentially printing money, although it's done electronically. And the United States, United Kingdom, Japan, and the European Union, all to various degrees were involved in it. And so what happened was that created an extraordinary amount of additional capital which was flowed into the world economy. And so cash is essentially a commodity. Oversupply meant the cost of it actually went down. So interest rates were lower. That's a very simplistic explanation of why interest rates were lower. There is talk of that quantitative easing starting to slow down and stop in some of those economies, but it will take an awfully long time for the effect of that to work through economies. So my feel for it probably is that interest rates will stay within maybe a 1 or 2% margin at around about the rates they're at the moment. Longer term, hard to know, but the logic tells you that it would be very difficult for rates to be increased too dramatically, simply because it would upend so many people throughout the Western world. I mean, New Zealanders have obviously gorged themselves on debt over the last 10 years buying property. A backward move, an increase in interest rates over the next couple of years that pushed some of those properties that were bought toward the closing months of the boom would essentially push people into negative equity, and I suspect that's unlikely to happen.
That's especially I was quite worried about that at the time, especially the first home buyers that were buying $800,000, $1 million homes, first home, peak of the market, interest rates have to go up 1% or 1.5%, and they'll be shocked to bits.
Absolutely. Yeah. Having said that, it's only so the equity position is not too much of a concern because equity is only a moment in time of the property, providing you're hanging on to it for a period of time. That's not too big a concern. But if the cost of the money that you've borrowed to actually make that happen goes up, that can have a somewhat more deleterious effect on that situation.
Right. Okay, so Ashley Church is saying, which I totally agree with the market at the moment, it's going to be flat probably for another 3-4 years. Interest rates will probably stay the same. Where do you make the money in property?
Oh, so it's interesting. I was actually I post quite vociferously on LinkedIn, and I was doing LinkedIn post yesterday on the somebody had written an article in the Herald about the program The Block, and they were talking about the fact that the Block as a format for a television show no longer worked. And of course, my post was basically to say the problem wasn't with the format, the problem was with the fact that, the reason they were making that comment was because in the last season, the people that actually completed the house that won made very little money.
Yeah.
And so the point I made in reply was the reason they made very little money wasn't because there was anything wrong with the format, it's because where they were in the cycle. So the way the block works is you put a valuation on the property when it's completed, and then anything which is made over and above that assessed value is what they make as their profit. In a market where it's flat, nobody's going to pay above assessed value. So the point I'm making is that while that's true of property where there's an understood value for that property, there's unlikely to be an increase. If you can add value to property, in other words, if you can buy a property in this market where you've negotiated the price well, and you've made improvements to that property that substantially improve the perception of its value to a buyer, then that's your opportunity to actually add value and to increase what you might make on that property over time. It's still risky because you're gambling on somebody being prepared to pay more for something than they might otherwise have paid if it wasn't in the condition that you improved it to. But if you understand how that works and can do that well, then there's a reasonable dollar to be made out of that.
Absolutely. Good. We've got a lot of our buyers at the moment are buying in Christchurch. We are doing some marvellous things down there. We're working with builders and people that are professionals that are doing that. We're doing it personally myself down there. What's your take? The Christchurch market, in my opinion, is its own little wee bubble, or bubble's probably the wrong word to use. Different than the rest. It's different than the rest of the country.
Yeah.
And it's very, very flat there at the moment too. I see long term good gains there, but at the moment there's still money to be made if you buy the right property. But even properties that are finished or renovated still seem to be sought after down there, what I've seen. What's your take on Christchurch?
Well, firstly, it's worth probably just recognising with Christchurch that Christchurch is actually a really good case study in how to fix a market. And so Christchurch was fixed because of the earthquake, so there was replacement property to the point where the market was oversupplied. And that oversupply is what has kept prices flat. So if you take that as a cursory lesson in how to fix it, and if you applied that same solution to Auckland, then you would do exactly what Phil Twyford's doing. You would build as many houses as you could as quickly as possible in an effort to satiate the market and actually reduce prices. So in that regard, I think there's a lot to learn there. In terms of value from Christchurch, I think you're right. The long-term prognosis is good, both in respect of again, just the property cycle, but also in respect of I think, a predictable increase in population down there. In terms of the shorter term, same rules apply. If you can buy a property that you can add value to and increase its value in this current market, then there's a good opportunity there to still continue to do reasonably well in the market.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but yeah, that's great. Speaking of Phil Twyford, how many houses is he going to build this year?
Well, to be fair to him...
Have you got stats?
No, but I think to be fair to Phil, I mean, the media's beaten up on him over the prospect. So he put a figure out there of 100,000, and so media divided that by 10 because he talked about doing it within 10 years and said, well, that's 10,000 a year. Of course, it was never going to work that way. We don't have the capacity to do that. We don't have the infrastructure in place, and so my expectation has always been you might get 1,000 to 2,000 in the first year, you might get 5 to 7 in the second, you might get 10 to 15 in the third. By the third or fourth year, you'll be consistently doing 15,000, 16,000 per year, and that's reasonable. So I think we need to give them a little bit of latitude around that and see what actually happens.
See what's going on another 2 years from now.
Yeah,
great stuff. Okay, so what are any concerns or other things you see with the market at the moment of the property market, or your feel, any things you think listeners might be interested in?
I think that the mix of policies of this current government worry me in the sense that, I mean, for me, and I'm a little bit different in my opinion on this than some people, so there's a lot of talk about reducing the prices of houses on the market and doing things to actually bring house prices down. The social and economic impacts of that would be disastrous. You might remember a couple of years ago, a guy called Arthur Grimes came out and talked about dropping house prices by 40% and the government doing whatever it could to... I mean, that's an extraordinarily naive and silly thing to say, and if you did that, the upending impact on society would be far greater than any short-term benefit you might get from dropping prices. So your starting point for housing policy should always be protecting the equity that homeowners and property investors have got, and there's actually good reasons why you would do that. If people talk about there being no benefit to a nation and the increase in value of property, in fact that's actually not true. It increases something called the commonwealth of the nation. It means that what the nation's worth has actually increased. So for example, New Zealand homes, if you took all the houses in New Zealand At the moment, they are worth around $1 trillion, up from about $500 billion 10 years ago. That's actually good for the country. It means we're worth more as a nation. That's got all sorts of positive effects in terms of things that the country can do. So your starting point needs to be preserving the equity value of your properties, but you also need to be doing things within that suite of policies which are about making it easier for people to get into a home. Because one of the concerning statistics that we have at the moment is that house ownership has dropped by about 12 or 13% for people between 30 and 39 since 2001. It's dropped from 56% to about 43% over that space of time. Now that's a concern, so we need to be doing things to reverse that trend, get back up to those historical figures of being a property owning democracy. And so if that's not price, if you don't increase house ownership by reducing price, then the only other way to do that is to make access to finance easier. Now there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can drop your deposit rate, so you can make it easier for people to borrow by not requiring them to have a 20% deposit, as we did just a few years ago. You can restructure loans in a way that will make it easier for people to get into properties that are going to cost a little bit more, or potentially the government could get involved in that equation in some way. So policies need to take countenance, as I say, of the fact that you need to keep house prices up, but you need to do things to enable people to buy properties within that reality. Incidentally, once people get into the market, they're not worried about house prices anymore, because suddenly they're taking advantage of the fact that you're getting equity growth. So the concern about house prices is very much a situational thing for people prior to getting into the market. Afterward, they love it.
Right. On the LVR rules, do you think the LVR levels might come down a little bit in the next year or so?
Yes, I do. But I think that there's every likelihood that they'll be slapped on again pretty quickly once the market starts to take off again in 2021, 2022. So I would expect to see a reduction, certainly in the LVRs for investors. I'd expect those to drop to 30% this year, maybe even a little bit lower over that longer term. But the moment the market looks like it's taking off again, I think you can expect them to go right back up to that 40%. So it's a short-term game.
Just a repeat series going on every 10 years, isn't it?
Pretty much. It's like they've found a new toy and now they're going to use it every time they need to.
Yeah. No, that's all good. Interesting. I listened to driving home last night and talking about rental properties here. And the first article was a house being ruined, destroyed in Auckland by a tenant, totally destroyed, about 200,000 worth of damage. And how hard it is on investors, which it certainly is. And then the last article was the other way around, how this lobbyist group were there for the tenants about how they've been ripped off by the landlords and what have you. How do the government win with that? What do we do about that?
Well, I think it's truth in both positions, to be honest. I think there are some unscrupulous landlords who do provide properties that are probably less than we might expect if we were living in them ourselves, and expect tenants just to accept that. So to that extent, but I think that's a very small subsection of the total landlord market. So to that extent, I think it's important that we actually provide base standards so that landlords actually know what's expected of them. Conversely, we've got tenants who obviously don't treat properties particularly well. Incidentally, that's not just about malicious damage. I mean, for example, we often hear about mouldy homes and damp homes. One of the reasons for that is because people don't open windows. I mean, if you lived in your own home, you open a window, air circulates, you don't get mould. Often you'll get particularly young people who won't necessarily think to open windows, and then there'll be complaints that the house is mouldy. Well, of course it's mouldy. It's not getting any circulation of air through it. So those are often perfectly good homes. It's just that they're not getting the air circulation that they need. But it's a big issue, because if we look at the moment, and we were doing some stats on this just a couple of days ago, Mark. So about 42% of New Zealanders live in a rental property. Of those 42%, the vast overwhelming majority of them live in a home that's owned by a private landlord. There's about 640,000 rental units in the country. Of those, about 67,000 are owned by Housing Corp. Another 8,000 by councils, about another 12 by non-government organisations. That means the vast majority of the balance are actually, so by far and away the biggest number of rental properties in the market are actually owned by private investors. So that's a very, very important portion of the market, and so any policies which are going to mitigate against people being involved in property investment actually have a pretty serious impact on the entire the fabric of our society.
Absolutely. That 60-odd% you said are privately owned. Do you know, have you ever got any stats on how many of them are managed by property managers?
Yes, I do. About a third of them are owned are managed by property managers. About two-thirds by landlords. Which is
a massive 2/3 of that. So that 40% are managed by individual landlords. Some that do a very good job and some that don't
Yeah, so to put that in context, though, even at a third, that's about 180,000 properties under management versus about 63,000 owned by Housing Corp. So we all tend to think of Housing Corp as being this enormous large beast, and yet it's only 1/3 of the properties that are actually being managed by property managers in other parts of the economy. So these are big numbers.
Yeah, they certainly are. So, as I said, that's why if they start messing around with property investors too much, it's not looking.
They will create a crisis.
3 years' time.
They will create a crisis, and in fact, we're already seeing the early stages of that starting to happen.
Yeah, that's good to have another crisis going on, isn't it, for the media to talk about?
Yeah.
Jolly good. Okay, it's been great having you here. Is there anything else you want to cover before you head away?
I think we're good. I think we've covered most of the key points.
It's been great having Encyclopedia next to me for the last 20 minutes. So, hey, appreciate your time. I know you're a really busy man. You're only up here a couple of days every week. So, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mark.
Good on you. If you have enjoyed today, go to our Facebook page or in fact, wherever you've watched this, make a comment and say some good stuff about us. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time for the next podcast video. Thank you.